The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Nu skal jeg bede alle sammen at tage rigtig godt imod en kvinde, som for mig står for indbegrebet af jul. Her kommer Sissel. Kirkeby! Ja, Kirkeby.
Good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock here in the Chicago area. It would have been 10 o'clock, but a couple of days ago we turned our clocks back. So we went from Central Daylight Time to Central Standard Time. However, I was told it doesn't affect at all our notifications and our entire webinar schedule. We'll be giving about 50 or 60 webinars, classes, sessions, whatever you want to call them. And they'll almost always start at 9 o'clock, no matter what time zone I'm in or whether it's daylight saving. This is our 11th webinar. It's November 9th still. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. And if you want to see a little summary of what we're going to be talking about today, that's it. We'll be talking about tumors. As a matter of fact, it's such a big topic in pathology, and approximately what half of your patients are going to die of, that we're going to have 3 sessions on neoplasms or neoplasia or tumor, and today will be the first one. So the 11th session today will be tumor part 1. And then we'll go into more explanations and more details and more into the molecular basis of cancer in the next session, which will be 2 days from now, Thursday, the 11th. And then 1 week from today, we'll have what we call a histopathology tumor lab. So once again, I'm all excited because I get to show tumors under the microscope with virtual microscopy. I have to say something about this particular chapter here, or topic, so to speak. When we originally set up the course many years ago, there were other doctors involved in it, and I gave everybody the choice of which chapters or which topics they wanted to pick. And, tumors was one of them. And it turns out that everybody chose that as their first choice. So from a point of view of a pathologist who spends about half of his life, I've spent about half of my 74 years thinking and talking and diagnosing cancer. We all feel we're kind of experts. And then we talk to the real tumor experts, the oncologists, and often we feel kind of stupid because they often know as much as we do, and they certainly know their patients a lot better too. So we'll start now, my favorite topic, neoplasia, and here we go. Neoplasia. This happens to be a picture. We'll see many histopathologic pictures of tumors and gross pictures. And I probably would guess you don't know what particular kind of cancer this is. But I think from your knowledge of histology so far, you would probably imagine or figure out almost instantly that these little clusters of cells are not growing in an organized fashion. So it doesn't look like breast, it doesn't look like pancreas, but it's some kind of glandular thing, and you can see that there's some fibrous tissue that has an intimate relationship with it. You could say these clusters of cells maybe look like little balls or glands, and they seem to be very haphazardly. This happens to be infiltrating breast cancer. However, it could really probably be just about any type of cancer or malignant infiltrating neoplasm that has a glandular structure and has gone wild. So we'll be talking about the definition of tumors, the common nomenclatures, the general biology, biologic behavior, so to speak, of tumor growth, the epidemiology, and that's pretty much what we'll be talking about today, these 4 topics. Now, in part 2 of our part 3 series on cancer or tumors or neoplasia, we'll try to answer the question that you're going to have in your mind not only all day today, but perhaps for many, many years. What causes cancer at the molecular level, okay? We're going to talk about different types and models for carcinogenesis. We'll talk about the agents or the usual suspects or the carcinogens or the promoters, so to speak. We'll be talking about how the body fights it. And then we'll go into a lot of the clinical features, of course, as well. So this is going to be our entire schedule for the next 2 sessions. And then in the 3rd session, we're going to take the most common types of human tumors and show you how you could very, very easily diagnose them and show them their behavior under my microscope here, which you're going to be sitting on the other side of my microscope. There have been a lot of brilliant geniuses who think they can understand cancer, and most of them are called pathologists. And however, a man named Rupert Willis, very famous guy, I don't think anybody could have defined neoplasm. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean cancer. It could be a benign tumor. I don't think anybody could have defined a neoplasm better than this. So I'm going to show you this. I'm going to read it to you. And then we're going to talk about it again at the end of today's session. A neoplasm is an abnormal mass of tissue, the growth of which exceeds and is uncoordinated, like make that a bigger UN, uncoordinated with that of normal tissues and persists in the same excessive manner after cessation of the stimuli which evoke the change, the carcinogen, the promoter, the initiator, the cancer-causing agents, the usual suspects, so to speak. That's the Willis definition, and nobody can give you a better definition than that. In every case, we are talking about mutations which make the growth of tissues unregulated, uncoordinated, okay? So mutations cause cancer, and we know a whole bunch of things that cause mutations. Now remember, this is autonomous growth. So when we looked at all of the charts we've given you so far this year of the sequence of processes like inflammation, healing, so to speak, we always talked about how it's regulated at many levels. Well, in cancer, it's not regulated at many levels, okay? Now, you have to also understand the clonal nature of a neoplasm. Even if you had a couple of pounds of tumor cells, ultimately they were all derived from a single cell, a single clone, upon which normal growth control, genetically defined mechanisms failed because the genes were mutated. I hope I'm not being too wordy, but let's go into the 2 types of tumors, okay? Now, no matter what we talk about when we get into systemic pathology, we'll be talking about, tumors of the GI system, tumors of the lung, tumors of lymph nodes. There's always only 2 kinds of tumors: benign tumors, and as you would guess, malignant tumors. And they all generally have kind of a coordinated, uniform nomenclature. So, whenever you see the word oma, and it's not preceded by carcino or sarc, generally it's a benign neoplasm, like adenoma, for example, or chondroma or osteoma, okay? Now, if you also remember that neoplasms can also be divided, both benign and malignant, into whether the tissues that give rise to them are what we would call connective tissues or mesenchymal tissues, or tissues ultimately derived embryologically from mesoderm primarily. So for example, a benign tumor of cartilage is a chondroma. A benign tumor of fibrous tissue would be a fibroma. A benign tumor of bone would be an osteoma. Remember, it still fulfills the definition of neoplasia, but it's not malignant. We're going to talk about all kinds of things that differentiate benign from malignant behavior, benign from malignant tumors. Now, most of the tumors are epithelial, however. If you remember, epithelium is derived from ectoderm and endoderm. Mesenchymal tumors are generally derived from mesoderm. Although endoderm and ectoderm can give rise to connective tissue elements, a adenoma, for example, is a tumor that forms glands, or a benign tumor of glandular tissues or glandular organs. A papilloma is a tumor with finger-like projections. It could be glandular, or it could be squamous, or it could be lined by transitional epithelium. But microscopically, and possibly sometimes even grossly, it has kind of a shaggy, grass-like appearance. Whenever I talk about papillomas in pathology lab or in an auditorium, I always put up my fingers, because you have to imagine a papilloma growing like little finger-like projections. Another type of benign epithelial nomenclature, for example, would be a papillary cystadenoma. So papilloma itself can be a type of tumor, or it could be an adjective. If you have a tumor growing in a benign, limited fashion, but it has a papillary configuration, you might call it a papillary cystadenoma if the glandular structures also look cystic. Now, you know, glandular structures are generally round, but they can also be larger round or cystic. Now, here's a common name for a tumor, okay? But I wanted to warn you. A polyp, almost all polyps, in fact, here, I'll stretch my neck out. All polyps are benign growths. Notice I didn't say tumor, because most polyps, many polyps, are not true neoplasms. A polyp is generally any mucosal projection. Most of them are benign, and many of them are not even true neoplasms. So anyway, to make a long story short, you hear the word polyp, you should always think benign. Let me close this thing over here so we could let you see more of the thing here. Here we go. So what is this? Well, I think you could appreciate fibrous tissue, which is pink. I think you could appreciate that this fibrous tissue is branching out like a tree or grass or your fingers. And most of these little club-like or terminal projections still have a little connective tissue in the middle of the structure, but these bluer things are epithelial cells. So, first of all, we can call it papillary, okay? Secondly, if we examined it carefully by using our usual criteria for benign and malignant, we would probably conclude it's probably benign. So you'd call it an adenoma rather than an adenocarcinoma. Now, this particular structure is a common type of tumor found in a colon, as well as other places, like breast, let's say. And it has the word villus, V-I-L-L-O-U-S on it. Why? Because the villi, if you remember, on the intestine are also finger-like projections. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about this, although I'm tempted to, but some types of adenomas, which this is, it's a papillary villus adenoma, have more of a chance or more prone to develop into malignancies with time. And let's just say if a benign tumor grows in a villus fashion, that means you're kind of proliferating more epithelium because of the marked increase in, let's say, surface area. These are the kind that have a much greater chance of becoming malignant, in which case it would be called either adenocarcinoma or papillary villus adenocarcinoma. I know a very, very wise surgeon, and he was exaggerating a little bit, but even the pathologists will tell you villus adenomas often develop into cancer with time. Okay. Now, here's a colon. It's a colon that's been opened up. And you could see there are these little projections in the mucosa. Now remember, the definition of a polyp is anything that basically blebs off or bumps off or grows off that visibly from a mucosal surface. Well, this is the colonic mucosal surface, and you got these things. So without a doubt, anybody, not just a GI doctor or a radiologist or a pathologist, anybody looking at this through a laparoscope would say polyp. And then, of course, it's up to the pathologist to determine whether it's potentially malignant, whether it is benign and has a very low or almost zero chance of being malignant. And remember, some of the polypoid projections aren't even true neoplasms. So if it's non-neoplastic, rather than maybe hyperplastic, because just of extensive hyperplasia, then it is obviously not malignant either. Here's that same thing under a microscope. I want you to get the feel for the fact that these little circular structures are glands. This is a remnant of submucosa. This would be pretty close to normal colon mucosa, and so would this. And these big blood vessels are the same kind of big blood vessels you see in the submucosa. And then growing off of that, if you want to say bulging or polyping off of it, is your glandular tumor. And of course, you then examine this and you look for some of the cellular irregularities. And you also look, for example, its behavior as well. I'll give you an example of that right now. You see these little tiny glandular, benign-looking structures? Let me ask you a question. What if you saw those inside the submucosa or inside the blood vessels? You wouldn't have a hard time diagnosing it as malignant then, would you? Because even if it may not look malignant, it's behaving malignant by invading the stalk, the fibrous stalk of the polyp. So that's why when a surgeon actually removes a polyp that has a stalk on it, it's probably even more important to carefully examine the stalk than the polyp, the end of the polyp itself. Okay, so much for pictures. Let's talk about the nomenclature now of malignant tumors. Once again, if you want to think of tumors as either being of connective tissue or mesodermal or mesenchymal origin, a malignancy of connective tissue generally has the name sarcoma in it. Not just oma, but sarcoma. A sarcoma generically is a malignant tumor of connective tissue, whether it's cartilage, like chondrosarcoma, whether it's fibrous tissue or fibrous-like tissue, fibrosarcoma, or whether it's of bone, an osteosarcoma, maybe more often called osteogenic sarcoma, but this is basically the pattern that you would use for a malignant neoplasm of connective tissue origin. Always has the word almost always has the word sarcoma in it. There are tumors that don't, but this is the general rule over 90% of the time. Now, if you have a malignancy of epithelial tissue, whether it's squamous, whether it's glandular, you almost always have the name carcino in it. So an adenocarcinoma is glandular tissue that is malignant. Perhaps it just looks malignant. I'll show you some of the reasons why it might look malignant. Or maybe it's invading, like we said, maybe it's invading the stalk of that polyp that we just saw. A malignant tumor of squamous epithelium, very simple, squamous cell carcinoma. Where do you have squamous epithelium? Well, you have it on your skin, you have it in your oral cavity, you have it in your esophagus, you have it in your anus, and sometimes you have it in areas where you normally don't have squamous, but squamous metaplasia has preceded it, like in the bronchus of a lung, for example. Now, if you have a tumor in which you don't clearly see either squamous or glandular type of differentiation, you might call it undifferentiated carcinoma, where there's really no differentiation, but they still are epithelial cells. Either they look that way or you have given them epithelial markers to show that they are of epithelial origin. Okay, now remember, carcinomas can arise from any of the three germ layers, but most of the primary malignancies that arise from mesoderm are more often than not sarcomas rather than carcinomas. Okay, let's look at some pictures again. Or was I going to say something else? No, let's look at some pictures again. Do you recognize this as a skin? Do you see a stratum corneum? Do you see a whole bunch of different layers in the epidermis? Do you see generally a basal type layer? And this is all epidermis, isn't it? And the connective tissue, which interdigitates with the epidermis, is dermis. But you also see these clusters of squamous or epithelial cells deep within the dermis. And it shouldn't be there. It looks pretty normal. It looks a lot like the cells here. But this is still an invasive or infiltrating carcinoma involving the dermis of the skin. It probably originated in the skin, but could this, let's say, theoretically have originated in the lung and metastasized to the dermis? Yeah, technically you can. It can. But this is a primary squamous cell carcinoma, from where squamous cell carcinoma is the largest amount in your body, the skin. Now, if you remember at the skin microscopically, you'll see these tiny little hairs connecting most of the cells of the stratum spinosum, the thickest layer of the skin. You call those intercellular bridges. You may call them desmosomes or hemidesmosomes. You may call them tonofibrils, depending on what term you like to use. If those same structures happen to be in these little nests of squamous cells of the skin, you know it's a squamous cell carcinoma, don't you? And because you could recognize them, you might even say that it is a pretty well differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. In other words, it looks a lot like the epidermis that it originated from. Now, there's another term that I want you to understand, and you have to just stretch your imagination. This is often used with squamous cell carcinomas. See this little ball here, or a little ball here, or a little ball here? Could you stretch your imagination and say this looks like a pearl, P-E-A-R-L? Because if you can, in a well-differentiated squamous cell carcinoma, you should see plenty of these pearls, and they usually mean that the tumor nests, the infiltrating tumor nests, are from the same tissue, squamous cell, from which it originated. Oh, look it. Here's even better pearls, because not only do you have this little circular layer of cells in the middle, which almost looks like a stratum corneum because it's basically anucleated, but it's surrounded. So this is a well-differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. You shouldn't have a hard time realizing that right away, because it's not glandular. Even though it's circular, these are not glandular cells. These are squamous cells. If you were to blow this up, and we will in lab, and even later on today, these will look exactly like the cells, the stratum spinosum or the acanthocytes, for example, that we see in the epidermis. Now, what about this? Once again, I think instantly I can tell you that these are squamous cells. I don't think I have to do a big convincing job on that. But do you see that little yellow arrow? I hope you do, because I got a good resolution here on my computer. See that little clear zone that the little yellow arrow is pointing to? And there's a little clear zone here too. Here, let me make my arrow better. There's a clear zone along here. There's a clear zone around here. If you look at that really carefully, you see those tiny little hairs, the hemidesmosomes, or actually intercellular bridges is the best term when you're talking about tumors. And that also cinches the fact that these are of squamous origin. Plus, if they're infiltrating and they're epithelial and they're not glandular, I think squamous cell is a good possibility even by the process of elimination. Here we go. Let's try another guy here. This one's going to be so easy, I almost don't have to show it. These are not squamous cells. These are irregular, oval, and round nests of epithelial-looking cells, some of which have either some secretion or cells on the inside. And I think almost instantly by now, even from your basic knowledge of histology, you should say, these are glands. These do not look like glands which are growing in a normal glandular organ, like breast or colon or prostate or pancreas. They look like they're growing haphazardly. So haphazard glandular growth in which certain glands come into direct contact with other glands and there's no intervening fibrous tissue. Like here, there's a little bit of intervening fibrous tissue, but up here it looks like they're almost collided with each other. Pure and simple. I'm not going to talk anymore. This is your run-of-the-mill adenocarcinoma. Where could it be from? Well, it could be from any tissue or any organ that's glandular. Could it be colon? Could it be pancreas? Could it be breast? Could it be prostate? Technically, yes, okay. But all you could say is that's adenocarcinoma. And if you say, well, these look more like the glands you see in the colon than the glands you see in the pancreas, then I think most experienced people would probably guess this was from the colon. And guess what? I got a little note here at the bottom that said it was adenocarcinoma. And it arose in the setting of ulcerative colitis. Now, does that mean that ulcerative colitis causes cancer? Not directly. However, in any inflammatory bowel disease in which there is an increased turnover of glandular cells, that could provide part of the setting for the development of a neoplasm. But I want you to remember, and I'm going to make you stand up at some point today, stand up from your seat or your bed or wherever you are and recite something for me. And it's going to be something that's so important. I feel like sometimes I should be slapping doctors who say that hyperplasia causes cancer. Hyperplasia in itself does not cause cancer. Okay, we'll get into that later. Okay, now let's take a look at this. You've seen squamous cell within connective tissue. You've seen glandular adenocarcinoma within connective tissue. Now, I think you will agree that there are some cells here, perhaps this little stretch down here, and this little cluster here, and maybe a little bit here. These also look like epithelial cells. You could do an epithelial marker to prove they are, but you know, we don't do that every time we see this. But the rest of these cells don't look like glandular cells or epithelial cells. They look like lymphocytes. So in this case, you have a bunch of epithelial looking cells. You can't say that they're squamous. You can't say they're forming glands. So you might call this an undifferentiated cancer. Or if it was from a glandular organ, somehow you knew it was, you might call it a very poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. That means you can't find good evidence of glands. If this was from a skin or a lung in which you knew there was a squamous cell primary, you might say, well, maybe it's a poorly differentiated squamous cell. Okay, but I'm leading up to an interesting concept here, which I'm going to tell you about now, and maybe you knew or don't know. What about all these lymphocytes between the tumor cells? What does that mean? Now, normally we saw how epithelial carcinomas can invade connective tissue, but in this case it's invasive, but you see mostly lymphocytes surrounding it. So here's the question. If you saw a cancer that was surrounded by tons and tons of lymphocytes, would you think that those lymphocytes were maybe fighting, so to speak, the cancer cells? You think they might have been CD8 cells or killer lymphocytes? Yeah, whenever you see a tumor and it is surrounded by an abundant amount of immune cells, that means that there's an immune reaction against the tumor. And everything else being equal, it's better to have tumors in which your immune cells are fighting it than cancers in which there are no immune cells fighting it. Doesn't that make sense? Okay, that's just a common knowledge thing. Okay, we talked about benign tumors. We talked about malignant tumors. There are also tumors that have both epithelial as well as connective tissue elements. And both of them are really true neoplasm, but they have differentiated to be mixed. And for example, there is a tumor of a salivary gland. The most common benign tumor of a salivary gland is called a mixed tumor. Well, it's also called a pleomorphic adenoma because it has multiple forms, pleomorphic. So it'll have both connective tissue elements that might look like cartilage or mesenchyme, but it also have epithelial elements as well, and both are benign, okay? However, you can also have a tumor with mixed differentiation that's malignant. So take a look at this word over here. This word is carcinosarcoma. If somebody said that there was a tumor that they called from somewhere, you know, maybe the female genital tract somewhere, technically anywhere, but it was a carcinosarcoma, would you think it had both malignant epithelial elements, like glands or squamous cells, that's the carcin part, but also malignant connective tissue elements, that's the sarcoma part? So yes, you can have tumors with mixed differentiation, both epithelial as well as connective tissue or mesenchymal. Now, certain tumors will be given the name teratoma, and a teratoma can be easily defined. So far, all of the tumors we have been talking about have had ultimately origin from either ectoderm, mesoderm, or entoderm. But there are tumors that have been derived from more than one embryologic germ cell layer, and those are called teratomas. So if you take the three germ cell layers, ectoderm, mesoderm, entoderm, and a tumor has arisen from two of those, you would expect that it would be called a teratoma. And you would also expect, because it comes from two almost completely totipotential germ cell neoplasms, it might have a wide variety of differentiation. Maybe you'll see glands, maybe you'll see hair, maybe you'll see thyroid tissue, maybe you'll see tooth. Okay, but that's what a teratoma is. And teratomas, in practicality, probably happen to be one of the most common, if not the most common, solid or cystic tumor of the ovary of young women, okay? Now, we got to define a couple of more words here, which we call not true neoplasms. but they can look like neoplasms. And one is the word hamartoma. You can find these technically anywhere, probably most commonly in the lung, okay? But you see a disorganized mass of cells or tissue that are normally inherent or indigenous to the site of the lesion. For example, does a lung have bronchial mucosa? Does a lung have smooth muscle? Does a lung have cartilage in the bronchial wall? Yeah. So you might see a cluster of cells looking benign. You might call that a hamartoma. And it is not a true neoplasm. Most experts would tell you it's just an aberrant differentiation. However, it may look radiologically like a tumor, wouldn't it? Here's another topic as well. It's called choriostoma. Most often, or no, it's called choriostoma in the pathology books. Some people call it heterotopia, but probably the most common name for it is ectopic tissue. Okay, in the process of the development of the pancreas, you might have some pancreatic rests or nodules that the surgeon sees in the pancreas, and it might look like a tumor. It might even look like a metastatic tumor if there's multiple. What about endometriosis? You know that the endometrial glands should be inside of the uterus, right? But what happens if in the development of the Mullerian duct, some of those glands just happen to be spattered throughout the broad ligament or the ovarian surface or the colon or the bladder? You might think that that's a neoplasm, but it's not. It's just called endometriosis. And generically, the name would be choriostoma. But in almost all cases, we'll just call it ectopic tissue. Okay. Now, there's a pitfall I want to warn you about as well. We have some exceptions to the general rules that define benign from malignant. For example, if you have a hepatoma, a tumor of the liver, notice the word carcino is not in there. Notice the word sarc is not in there, but all hepatomas are malignant. That's why probably nowadays most people do not really call them hepatomas anymore. They might call them HCC for hepatocellular carcinoma. Is probably a better used term. Now, here's another thing. Did you ever hear the term melanoma? Well, it doesn't have sarc in it. It doesn't have carcino in it. But all melanomas are malignant. Same thing with seminoma. Seminoma doesn't sound like it has carso or sarc in it, but they're all malignant. Here's another, probably the most obvious one, is lymphoma. Here, I'm not going to make you stand up for this one, but let me tell you something. There is no such thing as a benign lymphoma. All lymphomas are malignant, okay? And of course the word leukemias, all leukemias, oh God, this is going to be tough. And all acute leukemias are malignant. But some of the chronic leukemias, we'll just say, are potentially malignant, okay? So this doesn't follow the carcino or sarc anyway. You know, blood tissue is basically mesodermally derived, but the word sarc is not in there. Okay, so here's your teratoma. It happens to be, I don't know, this looks like it's from the ovary because most of them are. And it has kind of encapsulated. If you see those tiny little strands, they could be hair. Probably historically the most common type of tissue in a teratoma is sebaceous tissue. Remember the sebaceous glands that grow at the base of the hair follicles or empty into the hair follicles. So this kind of stuff, this sebaceous material in hair is very often extruded from it. But technically, because it's derived from at least two germ cell layers, you can have a whole wide variety of other tissue types microscopically. What if I told you I have seen thyroid tissue inside of a teratoma, or brain tissue, or retinal tissue? And you want to know what this little white guy is over here? That's a tooth. I told you teratomas, being derived from very highly, almost totipotential tissue, can actually develop into almost any type of tissue. Could you imagine taking an x-ray of a woman's pelvis and you see a tooth? You'd probably call a dentist and get dental x-rays. But yes, almost any type of tissue is possible. Here microscopically is a teratoma, and I think you could recognize this as bone right away. Maybe you can see some of these little osteocytes within the bone. You can certainly appreciate the bone marrow, can't you? Because you can see fat and a whole wide variety of hematopoietic-like cells. But look, you got something that looks like epithelium, and you got mucus-like glands. So we have both benign glandular or epithelial as well as connective tissue elements. This happens to be a teratoma as well. And this is probably the most common type of situation that you would see in most teratomas, especially where they are the most common in the ovary of a young woman, where they are called cystic teratomas because they often are cystic. Or the more common name that most of the old surgeons still use are dermoid cysts. So why would a teratoma be called a dermoid cyst? Because the most common type of tissue that you see looks like skin. Look at that, looks like epidermis, doesn't it? These are absolutely all the sebaceous glands, probably one of the most common component of a cystic teratoma or dermoid cyst. Okay, let's go back to now the big picture again. Go back to low power and think about things in our microscope and the biologic behavior of tumors. What is the natural history now of malignant tumors? Well, first of all, there has to be something that causes it. Or let's say there has to be factors involving the mutations of the growth regulatory genes, correct? And then when you get a cell, which actually now is theoretically malignant, it has to grow. And often there are factors which make these cells grow independent of whether they're benign or malignant. So the things that cause the cancer itself, cause the mutations, are generally called carcinogens, or initiators is another term that's used. The substances inherent, which then cause the proliferation of the malignant cells, are called promoters. But the one thing, and the most important thing, and that is why I gave it the biggest font, in the natural history of a malignant tumor, is that the one thing that almost all tumors have, which qualify them as being malignant, is that they have to invade. They have to invade a capsule, they have to invade a basement membrane, they often invade the normal tissues that are around them. So this might sound like a kind of a stupid or easy question, but I could tell you in almost every pathology board exam I've ever seen or heard of, they always bring up the fact that the one most important feature that makes a tumor malignant is this concept of invasion. And sometimes the pathologist or the pathology report might use the word infiltration rather than invasion, but it means the same thing. Now, could malignant tumors then metastasize by another multi-step process just like we had a multi-step process in making that cell malignant, or a comedy of errors, or a sequence, or a saga, okay? There are also a sequence of events which potentially could make any malignant tumor spread through either lymphatics or blood vessels as metastases. Okay, so this is generally, in very much of a summary, the natural history of malignant tumors. The one word that it's almost always used on all the pathology reports and in the description of tumors is the word differentiation. We talked a lot about differentiation when we talked about growth and healing and how one cell turns into another type of cell. But in every tumor, especially the malignant tumors, you have to study the concept of differentiation, because depending on how good or how poor or how bad or how good the differentiation is, that's basically going to make a life and death difference to the patient. So let's make this very simple. A well differentiated neoplasm resembles normal tissue. That's why it may be hard to diagnose, because it looks a lot like the cells or tissue or area from which it developed. So well differentiated tumors could be hard to diagnose. Now, poorly or bad differentiated tumors are probably easier to diagnose, because they don't look at all like the tissues or from which they developed. They might have bizarre features, and we're going to see a bunch of those as well. So a poorly differentiated neoplasm does not at all resemble the tissue of origin, so it's easy to diagnose. Now, in an undifferentiated, which is even poorer than poor, and sometimes the word anaplastic is used when they're talking about an undifferentiated tumor. But generally speaking, the word anaplasia in general is almost synonymous with the word malignancy. But if this malignancy is not well differentiated, it's not poorly differentiated, but it's totally undifferentiated, it might also be given the additional term anaplastic. In that case, you might not even be able to tell whether the cancer is of epithelial origin or lymphoid origin or connective tissue origin, and you have to do a whole bunch of immunohistochemistry to determine what type of cells they are. So here we go, and I think you should know this already. Benign tumors, of course, are well differentiated because they look a lot, and they're not malignant too. But poorly differentiated malignant tumors have, as a general rule, a worse prognosis. So I know that this might seem obvious, but when you get your pathology reports and they're describing the cancer, everything else being equal, a well-differentiated malignancy is going to have a better prognosis, a better survival than a poorly differentiated. Okay, that's what they call grading, okay, or the degree of differentiation. Then there's another concept called staging, which we're going to talk about later, which is not necessarily how differentiated they are, but how widespread they are in the body. And staging is much more important prognostically than grading. That's why they do such a job. Now, let me tell you something. I'm not a racist. I went to a Black Lives Matter meeting a couple days ago. So don't think I'm a racist, but I got news for you. If you were walking down the street and you saw these guys, you would say, oh my God, these are bad guys. They look bad. And in the mind of a pathologist, instantly when they say cells, they would say, oh, these look bad. they're probably going to behave bad. That's also true with tumor cells. On the other hand, if you're walking down the street in Salt Lake City and you saw these people, oh, they're so nice, they're so white, they're dressed so well, oh, they have beautiful voices. These look like good people. They're not going to kill me. They're well differentiated. So anyway, from the microscopic point of view, if cells look good, they're going to behave good. If they look bad, they're going to behave bad. Okay, let me give you one of the most obvious examples in the world. Let's say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to show you a couple more pictures and then we'll take our break. But what is this? Well, if this was histology 101, you would say, well, they're spindly cells. They have some blood vessels. I don't see a lot of dark, ugly ones or mitotic figures or giant cells. It looks like smooth muscle. Now, if you said that this was normal smooth muscle, you'd say this is probably normal smooth muscle too. This is a benign tumor of smooth muscle in which the cells comprising the tumor, the smooth muscle cells, look exactly like normal smooth muscle. It happens to be called leiomyomas or fibromas. Okay, and grossly, these tumors are the most common in places where smooth muscle is the most common and thickest, like the uterus. So this is the most common benign tumor. In fact, it's probably the most common tumor of womanhood. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Here's about 13 or 14 inside of a uterus where smooth muscle is abundant. However, if you took a section through the middle of one of these smooth muscle tumors, you took another section through the smooth muscle of the intervening myometrium, you would say they look the same. And here it is microscopically. These cells look exactly like the cells microscopically. You could take the world's smartest pathologist and show him a picture of normal smooth muscle, and he could not tell the difference whether this is from a normal myometrium, which is composed of smooth muscle, or whether it's from a benign tumor of smooth muscle. Okay, I think I made that point. Here we go. I'm going to show you some more microscopic features of cancers now. Okay, the term anaplasia generally means cancer. Remember, we also said sometimes the word anaplastic carcinoma refers to a cancer that's very, very poorly or undifferentiated. When you get back your pathology reports and they're describing tumors that your patients have, most likely you'll see the word pleomorphism on it. You'll also very, very likely to see the word hyperchromasia on it when he describes the tumor cells. You may also see the word mitosis on it. You may see the word polarity on it, but not very often. So pleomorphism refers to the fact that the cells of the tumor vary tremendously in size and in shape. So rather than, let's say, being all kind of looking like each other, some of them are big, some of them are small, okay? Hyperchromasia refers to the fact that the nuclei of malignant cells takes up the basophilic dye, which is basically a dye for nucleic acids and the proteins or the histones which support them. They're going to look darker, bluer than normal. Okay, so the cancer cells look darker and they have a lot of more variation with each other in size and shape. And if the nucleus is bigger than most normal non-cancer cells, you'd have a higher nuclear cytoplasmic ratio. This is what the cytologists are very interested in. Because if you have a cell that has almost no cytoplasm at all, and it's dark, you might be suspicious that maybe this is a cancer cell. Another feature is that the chromatin inside of a nucleus should stain fairly homogeneously. So if you see clumps of chromatin, that's often a feature of cancer cells. Okay. Now you know that most cells should, if you're lucky, you might find a nucleolus. Okay. Cancer cells, even though they may have chromatin clumping and see little clumps that look like nucleoli, they often or sometimes have multiple nucleoli and mitotic figures. This should be pretty logical. Don't you think the faster at which tissue is growing, the more the more mitotic figures you should see under a microscope? So normally, let's say in a benign tumor of smooth muscle, maybe you see a mitotic figure in every 1,000 cells. But if it's a malignant tumor of smooth muscle, you might see one in every 100 cells, a 10 times increased mitotic rate. And of course, the location of the mitoses is important as well. And also, here's a concept now called polarity. I think this is the better example here. Now, polarity means if you have a gland, if you remember the way glands are arranged in these acini, the nucleus is towards the base or the basement membrane, and there's more abundant cytoplasm away from the basement membrane or into the lumen of the gland. That's polarity. Nuclei are lined towards the base of the cell. But let's say that you have cells like here, in which the nuclei do not look like that they're all at the base. They look like they're almost as common at the surface. Well, that's loss of polarity. And I wanted to show you another picture. And I think it's going to be coming up pretty soon because I like it. Now, instantly, what would you say about these cells? Well, some of them are big, some of them are small. But so they're pleomorphic. They're extremely pleomorphic. Would you say that most of the nuclei are much darker than they should be? So that's hyperchromatic. Could you say that the nuclei have clumps or dark chromatin? If you look carefully, maybe they have more than one nucleus. Anyway, what I wanted to say is, even though some malignancies are difficult to diagnose, in almost every pathologist I know, if you showed him this slide, within 1/10 of a second, he would just say malignant, because it has instantly all of the visually recognizing major features of malignant cells. I had something here that I wanted to show you, and I think I lost it. Anyway, let's take our break now, because we've been talking for an hour, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the features you see not in malignant cells or malignant tumors, but perhaps the changes which precede the downright occurrence of a malignancy, and that's called dysplasia. Dysplasia can be either something that is seen from a cellular point of view, or it could also be seen physiologically when you look at all of the factors, the multi-step process that's involved in transforming normal cells into cancer cells. That's also dysplasia. So let's drop this down. Let's put on 3 more songs. And I don't know, maybe I'll flash some pictures in front of you. But see you in about 10 minutes, folks. Okay, well, those were our 3 songs, and those were our 10 minutes. And I told you, I flashed the little picture up there that it was mostly spiritual music today. I didn't plan it that way, but I have like 1 million songs on my little TF chip. And those 3 happen to be very spiritual. They also happen to be mostly by the most beautiful female voice in the world, whose name is Sissel, who's from Norway, who is my favorite. It wasn't intended to convert anybody. You know, we don't do religion here. We don't favor Christianity or Islam or Hebrew. We basically all worship the same guy. And by the way, you could call him Allah, you could call him God, but this is the guy who kept me from dying last September when I almost died and my doctors thought I was going to die. Then it took me about 3 months to take my first step out of bed after that. And I can tell you, yesterday I walked 7.7 miles without a break. So I am drop dead thankful to the person that we dedicated our music to. I got another question here. Usually I don't do surveys or polls or anything, but this will be our last general path topic, except for about 3 or 4 more topics after this. You know, there are like about 10 general path topics, then about 15 systemic path. I normally just make up my own mind what to do, and I run this course like a tyrant. I don't listen to anybody's advice. However, I want to take a little opinion poll right now. I could finish the topics in general pathology after we talk about tumors, which will be just a couple. Or we could start systemic pathology after tumors. So that's the vote. I want to see a couple people give me their opinions, because I really don't know what to do myself. Should we continue general or start systemic? Because traditionally, I usually start systemic after this. We go into the different systems and then finish up on general later. So, oh my God, I'm getting what I thought I'd get. I see a few people just instantly said start systemic. Well, that's what I really wanted to do, but I wanted to make it look like a vote. So the one thing we could do now is just finish our topic in the first of 3 sessions on tumors. So let's see if our PowerPoints are still in place. Yes, they are. We talked about cancer, and now we're going to go into some of the factors of pre-cancer. We mentioned this earlier when we talked about different types of plasias. Dysplasia, as a general rule, used almost all the time, except for a few exceptions. Dysplasia means abnormal growth, and it usually means the steps, the processes, the series of genetic mutations causing progressive changes which ultimately result in a clone of malignant cells. So the process by which normal cells become cancer cells is called dysplasia. It can take weeks, it could take months, it could take years, okay? But dysplasia itself is something that you could see with your own eyes. You could see normal cells, and then you start to see some atypical changes, and then they get worse and worse. And at some point in time, when you have some obvious evidence for not only malignancy from a cellular point of view, but perhaps invasive, then it's no longer dysplasia, it's cancer. Almost all cancers of almost any type are preceded by dysplasia, but not all dysplasias have to become malignant, okay? So in dysplasia, we see some microscopic features of malignancy, but they're not overwhelmingly convincing. For example, uterine cervix can have dysplasia, okay? That's generally regarded as the precursor to squamous cell carcinoma, but it doesn't have to. And there are plenty of case reports where dysplasia has reversed, but usually it does not reverse, okay? colon polyps. We talk about colon polyps that could be benign or malignant, or you can see areas microscopically within certain types of polyps that you say, well, this is not downright cancer, but you better do another colonoscopy, in a few months rather than just wait for 10 more years, okay? So this is a very, very big gray zone. And sometimes dysplasia is given adjectives, whether it's mild or low-grade dysplasia, or may use the term severe dysplasia or high-grade dysplasia, high-grade premalignancy. And, for many, many years, I can remember having fights with other pathologists about whether something was cancer or whether something was just precancer. It makes a big difference because once you put the word carcinoma on a pathology report, I'll tell you, everybody goes bonkers. The surgeon does, the patients do, the insurance companies do. So those fights and arguments are not very common these days because most high-grade dysplasia is now regarded as carcinoma pre-invasive or carcinoma in situ. But remember, the dysplasia may not develop into malignancy, but it usually does not go away, even though there's been some case reports, okay? So high-grade dysplasia can be called cancer or carcinoma as long as you put the word in situ on it. And that takes away all of the arguments. Here's a cervix where is the most likely place you would hear the term dysplasia. Now, if you remember, the cervix or the ectocervix has a squamous mucosa. Okay, so it's stratified squamous, right? Well, in a squamous mucosa, you should have kind of a basal layer eventually developing or maturing into a flat squamous flat layer. And the cells generally should be darker only at the base because of the bigger nucleus and smaller or not as blue at the surface. But in here, most pathologists would say this is dysplasia. Now look, here's a normal one on the left. Do you see how the basal cells generally mature into the flatter cells, or what they would call a squamous cell? That's normal. This is not normal. Do you also remember that in a cervix, from your anatomy and histology, we have something called a squamo-columnar junction? Like we do in other places, like the esophagus, like the anorectal junction. Here's some squamous cells on the right. Here's glandular cells or columnar cells on the left. That's normal. Now, in this squamous epithelium, however, it's not normal. But it does not fulfill all of the criteria for being called cancer. And it certainly does not invade either. If it invaded, it would be an easy diagnosis, wouldn't it? You have a nice endocervical gland here, which of course is intact, okay? So you would call this dysplasia, classical example. Now, take a look at this squamous mucosa now. The cells at the base look almost exactly like the cells at the surface. And in addition to being dark or hyperchromatic and pleomorphic or varying tremendously in size, I think you could say this is severe dysplasia. But if you wanted to call it carcinoma in situ, you could, because remember, severe dysplasia and carcinoma in situ are pretty much the same thing. Not just in the cervix, but in other places as well. Take a look at this gland. This gland is intact, okay? Now let me ask you this. If this endocervical gland had squamous cells in it, would you call it cancer? Well, for those of you who say yes, you're wrong, because endocervical glands can have squamous metaplasia. But if you saw squamous cells within this connective tissue here, that means it invaded this basement membrane. And then, yes, you can call it cancer. So it's not just carcinoma in situ or severe dysplasia, but once it breaches this little membrane called the basement membrane, you can call it invasive. And then there's no doubt it's malignant and it's invasive. If it's invasive, it's malignant. What do we have here? Okay, so now we have gotten something called cancer. We've talked about a process called dysplasia. We see the variation in the cells. What we have not gone into yet is the sequence of genetic mutations which transform those cells into ultimately a malignancy. It's not a single step process, okay? So the time to develop one tumor clone could be years, from dysplasia, from normal cells to cancer cells during this long dysplastic period. Months, years maybe. And then once we have this obviously malignant, potentially invasive cluster of cells or cell, if it doubles 30 times, now we have 1 billion cells here, don't we? And 1 billion cells generally would weigh about 1 gram. So here we are. The theoretical single tumor cell doubled 30 times. And now it weighs only 1 gram. And that's probably about the size of a pea, okay? That's something that might be right at the edge of a discovery on a CT or MRI scan, theoretically, and that takes months to years, okay? Now, if it doubles only 10 more times from 1 gram, we're now at 1 kilogram, okay? And generally speaking, if you wanted to give an average, people that die with cancer have what they would call a lethal burden, and that's usually about in the range of 1 kilogram. That's total cancer. That might be the primary cancer and the metastases as well. That's a very, very rough ballpark figure. But if you did autopsies on people that have died of cancer, not with cancer, but of cancer, and you carefully dissected out the tumor, it'd be about 1 kilogram. Okay, now, the cells that are doubling and multiplying are called the replicative, okay? So this is called the replicative pool or the proliferative pool or the proliferating pool, because these are the cells that have the capacity to multiply, undergo mitosis, and they're malignant, okay? Now, even in tumors that are growing rapidly, the percentage of tumor cells that can multiply is always in the minority. Maybe it's only about 20%, okay? Now, what happens to the other 80%? Well, they could be attacked by the immune system. They could mature or differentiate into cells which no longer have the capacity to multiply because they're fully differentiated or mature, okay? Or they could die from apoptosis for a variety of reasons. Hopefully, either effective therapy or apoptosis by the intrinsic immune system would be factors that cause this. And remember, when you give chemotherapy or radiation, but probably mostly chemotherapy, the cells that are your primary target are these 20%. They are the cells that can multiply. If you have cells that can't multiply, then anatomically and clinically, that part of the tumor is not going to get bigger or spread or maybe even metastasize. Here's a nice diagram with what I just said. Here's your normal cell. We have this dysplastic saga turning into a single tumor cell. this single tumor cell multiplies 30 times, and it's only about 1 gram or a billion cells. And I'll tell you, if you put a 1 gram tumor about the size of a pea in the lung, it may be very much at the limits of X-ray or let's say CT. You're not going to hear many tumors from the radiologists that are less than 1 centimeter. That's approximately their level of detection. But if that tumor cell doubles or multiplies 10 more generations, now you have a kilogram. Okay, well, how big is a kilogram? Maybe about as big as a softball. But that would include the metastases as well. Generally speaking, if a malignant tumor is big, chances are it's metastasized to whatever the places are which they normally metastasize to. And different kinds of tumors generally favor certain types of places to metastasize. Not just the regional lymph nodes, but other organs. Here's our normal cell. Here's our tumor cell. Here's the tumor cell's variants. Okay, the variants could die. The variants could differentiate into cells that cannot multiply. But the cells, like the red cells and the orange cells, can differentiate into cells which are non-antigenic. They may escape immune surveillance. They may have the capacity to metastasize. They may have the capacity to invade. But the ones you want to go after are the ones that have the capacity to multiply. Because if you get those, you don't really care too much about the other ones. They're eventually going to die from apoptosis anyway. Okay, what are we going to do now? Here's your proliferative pool. Here's your non-proliferative pool. Your proliferative pool have your malignant transformed cells. They could die from apoptosis normally, like every cell in your body will do. They could differentiate into cells. They could go into a quiescent phase in your cell cycle. And these cells cannot multiply. But there will always be a percentage, and we said it's usually a minority, that can still continue to proliferate. And those are the ones you want to go after. What is the main single word that differentiates benign from malignant tumors? It's the word invasion. A benign tumor may be very well encapsulated by a fibrous membrane. Benign tissue can be normally separated, especially epithelial tissue from connective tissue, by a normal structure called the basement membrane. But if the cells breach or invade or infiltrate through that basement membrane, that is invasion, and that makes those cells malignant. Now, why did I put a question mark after this word unequivocal? Because we said if you have a tumor that metastasizes, then you know it's malignant, right? Well, there are a couple of very, very rare theoretical examples, which I'm not going to mention, but for all practical purposes, let's say if a tumor metastasizes, you don't have to figure out or wonder or argue about whether it's benign or malignant. Malignant tumors metastasize. They can also seed your body cavities, your pericardial cavity, your peritoneal cavity, your pleural cavity. And of course, they can spread through another multi-step process through lymphatic vessels and blood vessels. And think about it, if they go into blood vessels, what is the most likely organ that they'll wind up in next? Probably the lung, right? Okay, so that's why overall the lung is the most common place for metastasis of malignant tumors. Here's a tumor. Look, I'm not going to tell you what tissue this is. In fact, I didn't even label it at the bottom. But let's say it looks kind of yellow and pink. Maybe it's kind of a fatty tissue. But take a look at this tumor within this tissue or organ. Would you say it is sharply defined? Would you say it looks like it has a little white fibrous type capsule around it? Generally speaking, encapsulated tumors are benign tumors. Okay, this is the classical gross appearance of a benign tumor. It happens to be the most common benign tumor of the breast of younger women. It's called a fibroadenoma. Now let's take a look at it microscopically. Well, look, here's the tumor. And now you know why they call it a fibroadenoma, because most of it is fibrous tissue, but it has these little irregular glands, which if you looked at carefully would not have any nuclear features of malignancy. But it is very sharply delineated from the breast tissue here on the left. Here's a normal breast lobule, okay, cluster of normal glands. Here's some fibrous tissue. And the fibrous tissue looks like it's kind of separating the benign fibroadenoma from the normal breast tissue. You could call this a capsule, or some of the pure people might call it a pseudo-capsule, because they say true capsules have to have some type of epithelial lining. But let's just call it a capsule. Here's another breast. It looks kind of the same. It has yellow. And what if I told you that this white area was the fat? Now, if I asked you to draw precisely where the tumor ends and the fat begins, you couldn't do it. Look how irregular and jagged it is, and very, very difficult grossly to say whether this is bounded by a capsule or even well defined. So here's the question. I know you'll get it instantly. Is this tumor benign or malignant? Of course it's malignant. Look how it invades very, very subtly into the surrounding fat. And look, I'm going to give you a nice little microscopic picture. Not only is it not well defined microscopically, but look, you see these little clusters of cells? It streams off microscopically into the surrounding breast tissue. Now, most of the cancers of the breast, because the breast is a glandular organ, are adenocarcinomas, and most of them arrives from ducts, so most of them are ductal carcinomas. And probably, if you read the pathology reports on your patients who have breast cancer, it'll probably be called an infiltrating ductal carcinoma. And if you'd rather use the word invasive, or if you rather use the word infiltrative rather than infiltrating, these are all common descriptions of malignant tumors of the breast. Here's a closer view. And this is a point that I want to make. And I hope I can do it. We're not looking at this thing high power, but you do see clusters of epithelial cells microscopically. And they kind of are intimately mixed in with fibrous tissue. You might ask yourself, are they invading the fibrous tissue? Or is the fibrous tissue reacting to it, trying to choke them off? It really doesn't matter. What matters is that these epithelial elements that you see in the breast are not arranged at all like normal lobules, okay? They're haphazardly growing. And that's a term that's used very, very often when it comes to glandular malignancies or adenocarcinomas. They'll say a haphazard. Now, furthermore, if you saw some of these little epithelial structures inside of a blood vessel or inside of a lymphatic, which I don't think I could really do in this particular case. Okay, maybe I should have maybe next year I'll get a better picture. But when you see a glandular or epithelial cluster and it is clearly inside of a lymphatic or a blood vessel, which is endothelial lined, then you don't have to worry about whether it's benign or malignant, because you know it's malignant. It's already. And if you see clusters of cells in the breast or glands, and they're inside of lymphatic vessels, then would you think it's very possible that the lymph nodes are also involved? And of course the answer is yes. It's all a matter of how hard you look. Now theoretically, could they be within lymphatic vessels in the breast, but clearly the lymph nodes are negative? Yeah, of course, that's possible. But eventually they would be positive, wouldn't they? Let's say you were a blind man and I invited you to one of my autopsies and we cut out the liver and I made a nice big slice with the butcher knife and I put a blindfold on you, even though you're a blind man. And I say, would you please feel the surface of this liver? Well, you would say, well, this feels kind of uniform, but then I feel a bump here and a bump here and a little bump here and a little bump here and a bigger bump here. So let me ask you this. If you were blind and you were at my autopsy, would you still feel confident in calling this metastatic tumor to the liver? Of course you would be, because the surface, the cut surface, is not uniform. This might feel harder. It might feel softer. Or you might actually feel the edge of it when you rub your gloved hand over it. So that's the question, obviously. This is a blind man's diagnosis of metastatic cancer to the liver. Just out of curiosity, let's say I put the blindfold on you and I gave you a slice of liver and there were tiny little uniform nodules all over the liver rather than here and here and here, all over. Well, so what are these tiny nodules on? Maybe it was cirrhosis, okay, rather than metastatic disease. That's also kind of a blind man's diagnosis. Let's say I took you to my microscope and I showed you these glands and you learned about the haphazard growth of glands and you learned about polarity and mitosis and pleomorphism and hyperchromasia. And you said, well, you know, I think maybe this could be cancer, but I'm not sure. And then I said to you, you see these little lymphoid nodules on the outside? This is a lymph node. And then I'll say, what in the hell should glands be doing inside of a lymph node? And there's only one answer to that. It's metastatic adenocarcinoma to a lymph node. In fact, it's so widely metastatic, it may have enlarged the lymph node to 10 times its size, or it may have completely replaced the lymph node where you don't see these lymphoid follicles at the periphery anymore. So what does it mean when the nodes are involved? Well, we know that when lymph nodes are involved, it's not good news in general. If a woman has a mastectomy and clearly you do a very, very thorough job and you could honestly tell her you looked at every lymph node, you looked at every slice, there's no tumor in the lymph nodes. Well, that's a superb diagnosis. And often the woman, the patient, thinks the surgeon made that diagnosis, but he actually heard it from the pathologist. Now he looks like the hero. So, you know, in the old days, and even maybe a little bit now, but mostly historically, they would take out all the lymph nodes. But nowadays, most likely, they'll only take out maybe 1 or 2 lymph nodes, and it'll be the lymph node that would be most likely to receive the earliest metastases. Well, how do they know that? Well, because they inject a dye or a radioactive isotope near the tumor, and then if they see that in the lymph node, they know that's the sentinel node. It's the node that's most likely to receive. And that way they don't have to yank out all the lymph nodes and possibly cause massive edema or lymphedema. So many, if not most, I don't know the statistics, but normally they're not taking out all of the lymph nodes like they did in the classical Halsted radical mastectomy. And of course, the extent of lymph node involvement, whether it's one node microscopic focus or whether it's multiple nodes, or whether it's nodes in two different areas. You could quantitate those, and that's part of the TNM staging system, where N means the extent of involvement. And of course, a N0 would mean no lymph nodes are involved. But let's say a N3, for example, means maybe a lot of them are involved, or they're involved on both sides of the lung or something like that. And of course, lymph nodes that are positive have a much higher likelihood of recurrent, coming back, okay. If the tumor inside the lymph node looks bad or poorly differentiated, that's worse than if it looks good. That's a little bit of a factor. And they may give chemotherapy anyway, even if the lymph nodes are negative, because technically, just because you don't see them under a microscope or on CT scan, there could still be cancer beyond the primary. If you remember when we talked about genetic diseases, we talked about the shocking fact that there may be tumor DNA inside a patient's blood system, even if there's no microscopic or gross evidence whatsoever of the tumor being beyond the primary. So here we go. Let's make this easy, and I'm glad that I finally got these two pictures I put in yesterday. Benign tumors generally grow slower than malignant tumors. Therefore, you would tend to see a lot less cells in the mitotic, metaphase, anaphase, telophase stages. So normal mitoses or low number of mitoses, which you could count under the microscope, is more of a feature of benign tumors than malignant tumors. Benign tumors are all well differentiated. They look a lot like the tissue from which they arrived. Malignant tumors can look well differentiated, but generally speaking, they're not going to look very much. That's why the benign tumor, the well differentiated malignancies are hard to diagnose, but they behave well. The poorly differentiated malignancies are easy to diagnose, but they behave bad. Of course, local invasion you did not see with the benign tumor. Benign tumors are very well cohesive, maybe they're encapsulated, and they don't breach or invade or infiltrate beyond the basement membrane. Whereas malignant tumors infiltrate. What is the one feature, the main feature? That's why it's in the biggest, most colorful font. What is the single thing, this is a board question, that differentiates malignant from benign tumors? Infiltration. Benign tumors do not metastasize. Malignant tumors can, but they don't necessarily have to. Here, I took out something here, which I probably should have put on a different page, but look. This is a microscopic picture of a tumor. Now, do you remember from high school biology that in anaphase the two chromosomes separate? But look, it's bipolar mitosis. But what if you have a tripolar mitosis? Or a quadrupolar mitosis? Or a mitosis where the chromosomes are just kind of strung out in all directions? Or the chromosomes are arranged like a circle, or they're arranged like a picture of Where's Waldo, with two eyeballs and a nose. This is what they call an abnormal mitosis. And this is something that if you see a mitosis in a tumor, and it is not your normal bipolar mitosis, but it looks like a Mercedes-Benz sign or going off in 3 or 4 or 5 directions. All abnormal mitoses are generally regarded as malignant. Now, are there some rare examples to that? Yes, but 99% of the time, it's true. Let's go into some statistics. We're near the end of our second hour. You know that this is an incidence diagram for men and women. The number one incidence cancer in men is prostate, and the number one incidence cancer in women is breast. After that, they follow approximately the same order. For example, lung is number 2 in both sexes, colon is number 3, bladder is number 4. But you should know that prostate is number one incidence in a man and breast for a woman. Here is mortality, okay? Even though lung is in second place for incidence, it's in first place for mortality. That means that lung is not as common as prostate, or it's not as common as a breast, but it's a bigger killer. Why? Because it's harder to diagnose easier, and it behaves worse, okay? There's been a lot of advances with prostate and breast, but number one killer is not prostate for a man or breast for a woman. It's basically lung. Let me see if I got another nice thing here. Oh yeah, this is goes by year. Here we are in the 1970s, and here we are up till like about 20 years ago. Generally speaking, what would you say about most of the cancers? Well, they were generally rising a little bit, but let's say in the last 20, 30 years, they have not risen too much, and some of them, like lung, and that have actually declined. Prostate has declined pretty well, only because of increased diagnostic and therapeutic methods. Breast has gone up. Look how much more common it is than all the rest of them in women. But let me tell you about prostate. And you're not going to believe it, but I'm going to tell you anyway. And then you're going to go look it up and you'll believe it. And you could even answer in the question box if you want to. If you're an 80-year-old man, what are your chances of having some focus of adenocarcinoma in your prostate? For example, let's say you did an autopsy on 100 guys, and they all died of, heart disease, lung disease, or cancer of the brain. What percentage of those 80-year-old guys is probably going to have an incidental focus of cancer in his prostate? Are you ready for a shock? Yes, somebody gave me the right answer instantly. 80%. So if I'm 74 years old, which I am, what are my chances of having some focus of prostate cancer? If somebody removed my prostate now and looked at it very carefully, probably more than 50%. 80-year-old men have an 80% chance. That's how common it is. Now, with the advent, look how somewhere in the early 1900s, it's kind of come down quite a bit. I don't know, you could probably think of another reason, but I'm not going to be a guru and try to predict all the reasons. Look at this one. Look how, when you look at the years, we're going all the way from 1930, which is pre-World War II, all the way up to generally in the last 20 years or so. Look how the mortality from lung cancer has increased. The incidence and the mortality. I guess that people really started to smoke a lot after World War II, didn't they? In fact, look at, I think I have another thing here. This is perhaps a women now? Yeah, this is women. Look how women started to rise like about, 20 years later or so? That means the women started smoking about 20 years after the men did. The men started smoking during and before the war. Women maybe started generally in large numbers after that. Okay, I think I have a couple more pictures to show you before we call it a day. Oh, here's some statistics regarding heart disease and cancer. Now, all of your patients, 90% of your patients are going to die of either cardiovascular disease or cancer. Okay? And here it is over the years, starting at 1975, going to 2000. Look how heart disease has come down quite a bit. And now it's probably more likely to die from cardiovascular disease than cancer. But cancer is still number 2 without a doubt. And here we go now for people that are older than 85. Much likely to die from heart disease. Simply because if they survived the cancer up until then, they're probably relatively safe. That would be my explanation. Maybe you've heard something different. What causes cancer geographically and environmentally? Well, we know that sun exposure causes all of the common types of skin cancer, not just melanomas, but also the squamous and the basal cell. We know that blacks have a low incidence of melanoma, okay? And white people that have pigmented areas, like areola around the nipple, I have never seen a malignant melanoma of an areola. I've seen it everywhere else. We know about smoking, even though the big corporations hid it with billions of dollars of lies and propaganda for many years. We know smoking related. We'll go into the biochemistry and the genetics of that next session. Alcohol related. Fat people get cancer more likely than thin people. There are certain types of cancers, for example, like stomach cancer, very popular in Japan, but very relatively rare in the United States. And we could rattle off a list of viruses, like we know HPV causes cervical cancer. We know hepatitis B virus, the cause of viral hepatitis, is one of the big factors for liver cancer, where it's much more common, like in Asia and Africa. We know that a certain herpes type virus called the EB virus is a key causal factor in lymphoma. And you know that lymphoma means malignant lymphoma. I don't have to put the adjective in front of it. Here's once again, stomach cancer being really high in Japan and prostate cancer being low. But if they come to the United States, and in the second generation, the stomach cancer goes down and the prostate goes up. Finally, in the next generation, the stomach cancer comes really down and the prostate goes up. And this is compared to the native good old American boys. California whites adjusted for that. So when people move from areas that have a high type of cancer to another area that has a low, eventually it may take generations for them to more or less normalize with the native population. Could that be geography? Probably more likely diet than geography, but these graphs are very common. Age. We know that young people generally don't get cancer, although the children that get cancers are probably going to have either some type of leukemia or brain tumor. We know that malignant tumors of bone are very often in teenagers, okay? But in general, most cancers occur in people over 55, in general. Okay, we know there are certain familial syndromes that are genes that are inherited, but in general, cancer is multigenic, okay, and is related to the family rather than traced down to a specific couple of genes, okay. What are some of the predisposing conditions? Remember, even though somebody put on the list chronic inflammation, I put a question mark after it. This is the part where I would almost ask you to stand up and recite after me. Inflammation does not cause cancer. Okay, I know there's a lot of physicians that don't believe that, but they're wrong. In fact, they're not only wrong, they're stupid. Because if they really understood what the carcinogenic process is, they'll see that inflammation could be a predisposing factor if it's combined with other things. And yes, there are precancerous conditions which are not cancer at all. We saw that adenocarcinoma arising in ulcerative colitis, or atrophic gastritis causing pernicious anemia. We know that there is a general loosely term called leukoplakia, which is a thickening or a whitening of mucous membranes, squamous membranes especially. And could that be precancerous? No. All it means is that it's white and thick. That's all that it means. But if it was cancer starting out, would it be whiter and thicker? Yeah. Okay. And of course, we're going to talk next class on the immune system role in cancer. And wouldn't it be logical, and it's the truth, that the stronger your immune system, not only are you protected from inflammatory and infectious diseases, but you also have all the machinery to protect you from cancers as well. I think we're done for today. Let me see what's next. Oh yeah, this is where we started out today. We talked about Willis's definition. I think it's worth reading again, and then we'll play our final song. Neoplasm, abnormal mass of tissue, which is unregulated, uncoordinated with normal growth regulatory processes which are genetically determined. Okay, that's it. Let's call it a day. See you in a couple of days. And I think we got a nice song at the end. I don't think it's spiritual like the other one, but it's a nice song. Here we go. Rock on, buzzards.